Hello. Thank you so much for joining us today for the final panel in our Queen's Voice Lab panel series. Today, we're going to be discussing on-stage representation versus tokenism in opera and other vocal arts. But before we dive into this conversation, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Queen's Voice Lab. Queen's Voice Lab is an empowered community of and for professional singing artists, sharing ideas, concerns, and actions in order to build mutual support and learning, further our creative work, and amplify our advocacy for artists' rights and more humane, equitable practice and norms in the vocal arts at large. Today's panel will run for approximately 1 hour, after which we'll have some time for questions. Feel free to type your questions into the YouTube chat as we go along, and we will try to get to as many as we can at the end of our conversation. There will be time towards the end. So without further ado, I would like us first to just take a moment to meet the members of the panel. My name is Kamla Shankaram. I am a composer and soprano. I am a biracial Indian American cis woman, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. Why don't I ask Melissa to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thanks, Kamala. My name is Melissa Bonetti. I'm mostly a mezzo-soprano who sings classical and operatic repertoire. I am Dominican American, and my pronouns are she and her.
Great. Hai Ting.
Hi, my name is Hai Ting Chin. I am a biracial Chinese and Jewish mezzo-soprano. My pronouns are she, her, although I think that if I had been born 10 years later, I might have reconsidered, and I am still reconsidering whether that should be she, they. I grew up in California, and 3 of my grandparents were also born in the US. So I feel very American, despite all the complications of that identification these days.
Thank you. Paul.
Hi, everybody. My name is Paul Cheminchul An. I am a Korean American bass singer. I go by he, them pronouns. And in Hai Ting, I think we are about the same age. But for some reason, my 10 years, I feel the same way as you, but my 10 years, maybe after having kids just went by, just like I blinked, and here we are 10 years later. I am a bass, and I operate and dwell in the operatic, concert, new music, weird music, awesome music, on the stage, off the stage, and I'm sure we'll get more into what we do later, specifically as we talk about some of these topics.
You will indeed. And I think it's so interesting to start off this way with everyone choosing how they see themselves and describing how they see themselves, because that really is pertinent to what we are going to talk about today, which is this issue of what does it mean to have true representation and what does it mean to be tokenized. And so I think to start off, that's the question I'd like to toss over to all of you is what, in your experience and in your career thus far, what do you consider to be tokenization? Before we can discuss it, we should sort of have an idea of what we're talking about. Why don't we start with Hai Ting?
To me, tokenization is when someone is hired for the way they look and slotted into a spot that someone feels needs to have a certain box checked, so that someone in the hiring sphere, someone in management can say, tick, we have one of those. That is classic tokenization. One of the best examples of it is the way Broadway choruses, I'd say before the pandemic, would have one of each. But they would be, depending on the style of the show, the majority of a Broadway chorus would be one race, one perceptible race, and we can get into that later. But mostly it was like, if it was Rodgers and Hammerstein, everybody is white, unless it's The King and I, in which everyone looks Asian. But then there's like one Black presenting person and one Asian presenting person, so that someone can say, this chorus is diverse. Tokenization, check.
Right. So tokenization as checking boxes about how the person represents. I want to underline that point that you made. It's how the person presents to somebody else, not how the person feels about their own presentation and expression. Melissa, do you want to add anything?
I think that tokenism can be very obvious when there is only the hiring of one or very few people of color without any other work being done, without any other conversations being had between those artists and the person who's doing the hiring. So I think that process kind of defines whether it is tokenization or not. And I think that for it to not be, I would expect for somebody to hire me on a piece and have a conversation with me in a way that is first asking me if it has to do with race, for example, if I feel that that piece would be something that I would be interested in doing, and if I would be okay with the role. I would like to know why they're programming it. I would like to know what kind of support I'm going to have in the room when I get there. All of these things. So I think it has a lot to do with the process underneath the hiring.
Right. So sort of digging in more to the assumption that because a person presents outwardly as belonging to the culture that is the topic of whatever concert series or opera, that then that person must be interested in being part of it.
Right. Because everybody has a perception of who you are depending on their personal background. And that can oftentimes not be the way that you think of yourself. And totally apart from that, somebody might think, oh, would you be excited to do this thing that represents your community? Not realizing that maybe the subject matter is not something I can really get into today or right now at this moment. Maybe that, yes, it's great that a story is being said about somebody that looks like me, but no, maybe I don't want to be doing yet another triggering opera about, for example, like the immigration crisis, the refugee crisis at our southern border. Maybe I don't want to do another opera about that. So the conversation needs to be had, and also the lingering atmosphere of I'm giving you an opportunity instead of, well, I'm just another artist, instead of like, look, I have this opportunity for you because you're a person of color. Also, that kind of talk in the background of the whole thing is another telling factor, I think.
The assumption that a gift is being given almost.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
Paul, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this issue, part of it in a little bit of a macro level. If you look at the industry, and I'm just going to just right now say, without getting too deep into it, I'm just going to say, the professional vocal arts encompasses opera, concert music, much, even though some of the topics we're talking about are opera focused. Just when we say the industry, that it's involving a lot of different facets of professional vocal singing. It reminds me of when a corporation or even a small business comes in and rebrands itself without altering the innate culture of what they can control. And then so for our industry, if there is an X number of performers, however diverse that it might be, an organization can come in and brand themselves as a diverse thing by using the same number of people of color or artists, but not doing anything about but not shifting anything about what it is that makes up our, about our group. For example, if there has been a move to use more people of color in concert singing in the last couple of years, I often see that instead of inviting more people of color to audition or even having auditions to lift up some of the gates of gatekeeping, that they sometimes tend to use the same names and the same performers that they've been using, but just centering them around the concert series, and not really doing anything about giving more people a chance or doing anything about the way that diversity shakes out in the industry at large.
So is it true representation and reaching equity when the opportunities are not distributed equally? That's what I'm hearing, that if it's the same singers who are always hired for each of these concerts, or if they are siloed into the specific concerts that are supposed to be about creators of color or about themes that have to do with people of color. Is that true equity? I think this leads to a question that I'd like to pose to all of you, which is the difference in experience in participating in these spaces and works that are created by creators of color versus works that are ostensibly about BIPOC cultures, but not created by creators of color, because that's another question that I think that you're getting at, Paul, and I know that we have talked about individually, which is the sort of hierarchical layers of how all of these decisions are made. And what does it look like when you have singers of color, but no director or conductor or the creative team? They're not from the same cultural background. So I wonder if you care to jump in with your thoughts about this. Does it make a difference when you are performing in a space where there are more people up the hierarchical ladder that are also from a non-white background?
Yeah, I think about them as stories. I think about what we do on stage as stories. And, as it pertains to this question, who gets to tell these stories? And I don't think, in my mind, there's not a right or wrong answer. But the focus of, I mean, when we look back at the high romanticism of like early 20th century, late 19th century music, Western music, and we think about Orientalism, we think about, things of that nature, Turandot, Madame Butterfly, King Roger, even if they're not stories about a specific land, using using beautiful music trickled through Western romantic, you know, with that funnel. I don't think necessarily that, that's individually that's a wrong thing. And of course, we have to put it into the context of, the time period, and the time period being now, if somebody, if a person who is not native to that culture finds interest in some story and and tells that story, I guess there's nothing inherently wrong with it. But there's something really powerful, there's something really palpable and powerful when you get into a room, whether it's as an audience member or co-creative or a person that's performing, when you can tell that this story, even if it's not autobiographical, drips with generational knowledge, drips with beauty of their ancestors. And so it just becomes more powerful storytelling. I don't think, I don't want to get up on a podium and say, hey, this is not your story to tell. I mean, there are times when that line is obviously breached, and some things are inappropriate for people to tell as stories. But just in general, I don't want to be that guard and say you're not allowed to tell that story. But there's something really powerful when you get into that room and it's obvious that it's their story to tell.
Melissa, have you had an experience where you have been in a room that was full of Dominican people?
Not of Dominican people. That has never happened in my career ever. Definitely a room full of Latinos has been something that has started to happen more frequently. And it is such a tremendous joy to be doing classical vocal arts with other Latinos. And sometimes the creators are also Latino. It's never been 100%, but there is this joy. I honestly never thought it would happen. But I think to Paul's point, there have been situations where maybe the composer was Latino and the librettist was not, and the subject matter was a Latinx story. And I think, honestly, I also don't want to say, the definitive answer of what is right and wrong and who should be saying what stories. But if you're going to tell a story about a culture that is not your own, you have a lot of work to do. You have so much work to do. And there are so many layers of it also, because you have to learn about the culture, and then you have to teach yourself how to be appropriate, to be quite honest. If you don't already possess that, and I feel like a lot of white people are learning. So, I mean, they really have to do the work and understand when to, I mean, we have a young audience listening to this panel. They have to understand when to check themselves, and they have to understand when they might be in a space that, even though they are part of the creative team, maybe they feel like a foreigner, and they have to be okay with that. You know what I mean? If they're deciding to tell the story in the first place, I'm sure it's with great intentions. I would doubt that anybody who wants to tell a story of a culture that is not their own has any malice behind it. So that's already, I think, a given. But I've been in situations where maybe some of the creative or the leadership perhaps doesn't feel so comfortable in the beginning, and then over time they realize that, you know, they've decided to do this, and so they're just going to have to know, like, you know, the Latinos are over here talking in Spanish. Maybe you don't know what we're saying, and that's okay. You know what I mean? That should be fine. So, or maybe we're talking about like some cultural reference or something, or maybe we're saying something that's okay for Latinos to say amongst each other that you cannot say about Latinos, for example, you know? And you should know when that moment is. I don't need to teach you that. You know what I mean? So you really got your work cut out for you. But yeah, I'm happy to be in that situation. I'm happy somebody is putting the work up. You know, if it wasn't for them in that specific show that I was doing, it wouldn't be happening, right? So I'm glad to be there. I'm glad to be with other Latinos. I'm glad they decided to tell a story that it's important to me. So yeah, it's just everybody has to be willing to learn in that space.
I'm gonna expand on this conversation a little bit and just ask, because I know that there have been many conversations over the last couple of years in particular about the additional labor that is expected of people of color in spaces that are overwhelmingly and historically white. And I'm wondering how you all feel about that, given, Melissa, and to some extent, Paul, what you have just said about being in these rooms where perhaps the creator, director, conductor are not of the same cultural background, but are willing to learn. Does it feel like it's additional labor for you to teach them? Hai-Ting, I know that you're having some of these conversations right now. Yeah, not in the context of opera, but do you have any thoughts about this?
I do, but in a way, I was thinking while Melissa and Paul were talking about the idea of telling our own stories, I was thinking about how complicated that has always been for me, and maybe this relates to your question as well, because although I have this face that is perceived as Asian by the wider public, I grew up in a town where there were only 2 Asian people of any kind, partially because of a horrid history where my county in California drove out all the Chinese in the late 19th century and then literally passed a law saying that that Chinese people could not live in that county, which was enforced until the 1960s when 2 Chinese men, including my father, moved to that county. So I had no cultural connection to a Chinese community growing up other than yearly contact with my grandparents, my Chinese grandparents. I grew up a Northern California Reform Jewish girl. I was bat mitzvahed, and I feel like an American Reform Jew. And it's only at the points where people remind me, people ask, where are you really from? Or, wow, you speak really good English, or which just doesn't happen to me in New York. And I think that probably young people who have grown up in Queens probably don't deal with this in the same way that we did growing up in the 80s and 90s. I'm sure, I hope that it's a completely different experience for them. And I do find that I love living in New York, and I loved living in Queens partially because it was such a grand mix of cultures and faces and languages that I had not experienced growing up. So the idea of telling my own story, like what is my own story? People, if I told a Jewish story, people would be like, that's not your story. And I really don't want to be a gatekeeper saying something like that to people who don't look like the who don't look like the story they're telling to an American audience. And Kamala, I think you must experience this a lot yourself. I think you are maybe even more white presenting than I am. And I have been in the room when people have said, so why are you interested in that Indian story?
Yeah.
And you've had to explain yourself. So, but also answering the immediately previous question, because of my face, people in the majority white classical spaces that I have been in for the last decade or two, after the pandemic and the increased awareness of racial tension issues, a lot of people turned to me as the least white face in the room and asked me to do the work of diversifying their institutions, or asked me to help with it. And that was bananas to me. And yet I want to help do it, but what qualifications do I have for that? How much extra energy do I spend on it? How much of imposter syndrome do I have when asked? Then, like, who am I approaching with that ask? I know the same people you know. All I can do is try to inform myself and try to use whatever little influence that has to help do the work that people are befuddled about doing. But I feel I'm just as befuddled, honestly, having the feeling like that is already my space. And I don't, I mean, I can suggest things, I can, but I can just ask people and keep my ears open, and try to use whatever, try to use the extra attention that, because I'm getting extra attention right now for the way I look, it makes me realize that the opposite must have been happening behind my back without me knowing about it. And that's disturbing, but at least I'm becoming aware of it because I'm at a moment where it can do some good for me and for my colleagues of color and for the possible next generation that I can help welcome in. But it feels really weird from the inside.
And I think there's some really important points that you've just made that I would love to focus in on. One is that somebody's face does not equal that person's experience. And there are correlations between the two, of course, but your experience growing up as a Reformed Jew in Northern California is not an experience that the stereotypical assumption about you would allow a person to make, right? And so I think that that's something else that we can include in our definition of tokenization, quite honestly, is not allowing people to be their full selves. And I think that going back to some of the points that you all made at the beginning of the conversation, that's really what we're talking about, right? Is checking a box based on someone's face, not on their lived experience. But the converse of this, and Haiting, you brought up that article. Could you remind me of the philosopher's name now, because I'm blanking on it. Oh, and we have lost your sound. I think you're muted.
Sorry, I'm muted. Maybe it was Freudian because I don't know how to pronounce his name.
Oh.
But I think it is Olufemi Taiwo.
And I think one of the things that this article points out is that because people's lived experiences are so different, asking a person of a particular race to stand in for the experiences of that entire race is also flattening, right? And I think, Melissa, one of the things that you brought up earlier are these trauma narratives that so often come up in contemporary opera. And that we hopefully don't actually have experience of. So how, how is that more authentic a representation in some ways? And I think that that was the point that this article is also trying to make, that if you are asking someone who comes from an upper class background to make policy decisions about people who are growing up in poverty, they don't necessarily have a better idea about that because their face matches those people's faces. And I think that this is part of where it gets really tricky, right? Is that wrapped up in all of this are issues of class as well, class and access. And so when we're talking about how do we diversify classical music, whether that's opera or choral music, we're also talking about not just how do we diversify what the faces are, but what people's lived experiences have been and how that brings them into classical music. And I think this brings up one of the things that I know that we have all talked about before this public conversation, which is the assumptions about what kind of skills people are going to bring into the space. And I wonder if any of you would care to dive into that question. And this specifically came up around how do we bring singers into the choral tradition, right? And what kind of assumptions are we making about how they should sound and what kind of skills they should have? So maybe, Hai-Ting, since you were talking about this with specific audition in mind and sight reading and straight tone skills, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. One of the things that I was asked to do this past year was to help bring more Black identified singers into a very white choral orchestral space. And having already said I am completely unqualified for this, and I honestly being asked is insulting to many different ideas, people, and possibly to me, but I wanted to do the best that I could to help. And one of the things that happened is that the white conductor, who I think really had their heart in the right place, held open auditions, but the things that they demanded from the singers, and then which included sight reading off the page, and easily singing straight tone on demand. As soon as someone struggled with this, the conductor dismissed them as a viable musician. And these are the idea that these skills are the ones that are needed to do well in that space is one of those things that is, in the end, that is right now, at least, kind of systemically racist. No one intends for it to exclude singers of color, but it does. And whatever the reasons, whatever the traditional reasons or the educational reasons or just the preference reasons, maybe singers in certain traditions don't want to make that kind of sound, don't consider it beautiful, don't consider it something worthwhile, because for whatever reasons, and maybe a number of reasons, that excluded them from this conductor's list. And then the conductor came back to me with frustration that none of the people that they had auditioned could do what they wanted, which I'm describing this. I don't know that it's something that needs to be solved. because
But it should be recognized.
it should be recognized, and it should be recognized that this is the kind of invisible systemic racism that happens all around us. This is just a weird esoteric classical music example of it.
But it's at the heart of some of the conversations that have been happening in classical music as a whole. For example, the whole controversy around Philip Ewell. And Philip Ewell is a Schenkerian music theorist. For those of you who haven't had to do Schenkerian theory yet, it's a very specific way of trying to reduce a piece of music as a progression from the 5 of the scale down to the 1 at its most basic reductive way of describing it. And Schenker suggests that any music that doesn't do this is not as beautiful as music that does. So Philip Ewell at the Society for Music Theory conference a couple of years ago said, well, we know that Schenker is actually a racist person because we have letters documenting this. And this way of thinking about music excludes music from non-European cultures. So can we really use this as the basis of describing what is beautiful in music? And this, of course, caused a huge uproar, despite the fact that Philip Ewell is a Schenkerian and likes the theory. And I think it's always good to realize that our aesthetic judgments about things are not objective. They are always grounded in a culture and a particular cultural way of seeing things. So I think highlighting that this sort of pure choral sound that is the high mark of Western classical choral singing, I think pointing out that it is a different notion of vocal beauty from other cultural traditions is important if we're really, really serious about continuing to diversify the kinds of singers that we see on stages, because we may need to change how we think about who we bring in and how we train them and how we make them feel welcome. Paul and Melissa, do you have any? Oh, hi, sorry, Haiting, I see you.
Oh, no, I just wanted to say something that often occurs to me in this particular tiny corner of things, that the idea of saying they can't sing straight tone is such a classically racist way of thinking about things, but it is another example of a way that a lot of previous generations thought about things, and the racialization of a sound is there's such a long tradition of it, and it, especially in America, it's once again like equating the color of your skin with some characteristic about you that is not immutable. And when we all engage in these things because we're humans and we like to put things in categories and add different characteristics, and I don't know whether I have a point or I'm just stating this because it's something that we all do, and it adds to the problem on all kinds of levels. That's maybe not a deep point, but
I think it is an important point also, though, because one of the things that we talk about a lot in opera now is how do we categorize voice, and should we still hold on to the Fach system? Does it make sense to categorize someone as a soprano or a tenor or baritone, particularly now that there are so many trans singers who are trying to come up in the world and struggling with where they fit in this old system? But then the other part of that is, for singers of color, how do they fit into the system? If you are a Dominican mezzo, what does that mean that you're supposed to sound like? If you're a Korean bass, what does that mean that you're supposed to sound like? And I wonder if you guys have any thoughts that are coming up for you right now around this question. Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I just want to touch a little bit on what Haiting was saying before. And when I've been similarly asked to do some of this labor, and first of all, it puts a lot on the person who's being asked, because, well, I mean, let's point out the obvious. If we are to truly speak our minds and truly do the work that they're asking us to do in good faith, um, and really challenge them and push back on, you know, some of their notions, some of their ideas of choral sound, or some of their ideas of like, well, and let's face it, you know, even in white European choral music, or that early music sound. I mean, I've read the treatises, you know, when I was in conservatory. Often the way that they're translated down to some of the, you know, musicians now, the music directors now, is through the lens and funnel of the English cathedral sound,
Mhm.
which is not the same thing as the 17th century, 18th century treatises of, you know, of these works. You know, when they talk about, yes, you know, there's sopranos, or everyone's, but especially sopranos, use no vibrato or use less vibrato. That is not pedagogically correct. That is not the intention of the composers. So even if they're trying to transmit what the original ideas and what the original thoughts of these, you know, ancient European composers were, they're still, it's funneled through, you know, a little bit, you know, it's funneled through early 20th century idea of what cathedral music supposedly sounded like. And because of radio transmissions of, you know, the lessons and carols of King's College and stuff like that, you know, they have a closer idea of what, you know, of what this pure, or I've even heard of this sound called white
White.
sound.
Yeah.
Yeah. Literally a white sound. And I'm sure, you know, a lot of them weren't meaning like, you know, white as in Caucasian, you know, European white. But, you know, that white sound, it's not a, you know, it's not necessarily a, you know, a correct thing if that's what they're going for. And just to go back to the labor part, you know, we're all freelancers. Most of us getting it, and I know this is for a younger audience, and most of the time, unless you're, let's say, out of grad school, you audition to, let's say, the Met Opera full-time chorus, and that's all that you do. Most of us are going to be freelancers, either entirely or at least by some, you know, by some part. So we have, a lot of times, you know, we have to watch our mouths, not real like, and have to translate when somebody says something to us. Oh, they don't really want an answer back, or they just want a nod and agreement, you know, for efficient use of time, but mostly so that they can, you know, continue to do what they do. And when they break through that line and ask people like us, hey, help me, well, yes, we can offer some of that help. Either, you know, even if we, you know, yes, and I just also want to say that, you know, if they're looking for me for my Rolodex of people of color, they want the people of color, but also they want the people of color to play by their rules. So if I have a Rolodex of people who grew up in the Black church culture, and oftentimes, you know, when you grow up in that culture, you know, a lot of my friends and colleagues are great musicians, are innate musicians. And even if, you know, somebody who grew up in the conservatory system, you know how to read solfege and can sight read on command, that is but a very narrow, you know, thing of what makes a musician. And oftentimes, you know, people, you know, those of us who grew up in that kind of culture, there's, you know, there is a wide and deep gift there that's often overlooked, or it doesn't. Yeah, you know, that's great that you can do that, and that's great that you offer that, but we're looking actually for something else. So to use my Rolodex, to use my labor, to use my network, they're not really coming in good faith then, are they? Like, you know, it's, yes, let me use your Rolodex, but for my purposes. And even if I do say, hey, yeah, I can see that partly you're coming in good faith, partly you are, you know, you're earnestly trying to do some of the work. but it's also, you know, as a freelancer myself, I have to translate, I have to code switch, right? And
Right.
say it back to them in the way that they will not look at me as, a difficult person.
Right.
I can't also say, yes, I can help you, but this is what it's costing me, because it's going to make me look troublesome. It's going to make me look like the person that's hard to work with, even though that they're coming to me, asking for my labor. So, I'm 43 years old now, and I am, pretty blessed and happy in what I've gotten to do in my career so far. And I've personally just, you know, that ask of labor has broken me in some ways, and I refuse to go with it, and I've lost jobs, I've lost positions, I've lost, probably, I don't know, like innumerable future work, because I can't really just do the bullshit anymore, and just, speak that language of deference, of like, of that, the cocktail talk, and we can all do it. We can all do it. We can all do it with smiling faces, but every once in a while that gets really tiresome, and I don't, and then I lose jobs over it. And it's happened on a few occasions at least.
Right. So in considering what it means to have true equity, there also has to be the recognition of the additional energy that is required in order to do the teaching work, and not have that be an expectation that's placed upon the people of color that you may be working with. And Melissa, I think you've had an experience like this also, yeah?
Well, not as much as some of you, but only in kind of a feedback way. People ask me sometimes if I have any feedback on a process in the middle of the process, or once the process is done. And, I have things to say. I consider whether I should say them, first of all, not because the person shouldn't get the information, but is it my job to tell them the information? So I have come to the conclusion, unfortunately, that, this is a feeling I feel that different BIPOC people share. If I don't do it, who's going to do it?
Mhm.
Unfortunately. And I don't say that to say to anyone who's exhausted to keep going. I don't say that at all, but I feel like it's a question that we ask ourselves. And so I decide when I have the energy to say when things should be going better in a process, and I decide when I'm being overused, and when people are taking advantage of me, actually, and when I really realize, like, okay, yes, if I keep doing this work, it will be beneficial to my community and other BIPOC communities, and in my experience, sometimes the youth, because I have worked often in different educational platforms with very young musicians. But I have to know when I'm being used, because how can I say this? There have been times when, as an educator, it has been sometimes thrown in my face, but these kids need you. But then the system in place wasn't supporting me, right? So if I just don't want to deal with these people anymore, i.e., I don't want to talk to them about needing better resources anymore because I'm exhausted, and I don't want to keep telling them how this can actually benefit the kids better, sometimes it gets to that point, and then I just, we all have our thresholds.
Right.
But yes, this has happened to me, I would say, more so in education spaces.
Right.
When I want to serve my community, and you forget, like, wait, I'm part of the community too. What about me? And then you have to see if you're serving yourself, or the people that are hiring you or asking for your help are serving you. I also wanted to say, to just circle back just briefly to a really lovely moment that I experienced, talking back on the way that we are expected to sound as classical singers. I want to say that there was an experience recently when, actually has to do with Haiteng. I was in a group of singers, and all of the singers were people of color. And there were so many wonderful things about that whole situation. But I remember during one rehearsal when I heard a melody in the piece that we were doing. And we were, I think, maybe in one of the preliminary rehearsals, and I felt like everybody in the room was kind of singing with this more choral correct sound. And the melody sounded to me like soul music or pop music or something like that. And I thought it sounded silly. And I said, can we sing this a different way? I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, Haiteng, but there was kind of a melody that sounded very soulful in this piece that we were doing. And I thought it was just as ridiculous as like taking a pop song and singing it operatically. Like, it was the reverse. And I was like, this sounds so silly. And we're all BIPOC people, like, why are we doing this? Let's sing this the way we want to sing this. Like, we're making our own rules here. It was, I just wanted to point out that moment, those moments are happening nowadays. And it's just a beautiful moment. And I feel like in that group, we were empowered to choose our own sounds, sometimes as an ensemble and sometimes as individuals, more individualistic, but still being an ensemble when everybody had a different sound to give and contribute. And that's what made it so special. Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
That brings up another question for me, which is around spaces and making people feel supported within the space, right? And I've heard a couple of points around this. One, which has to do specifically with opera, which is, how do you support your singers when you're asking them to go somewhere that is a new place, and maybe this place doesn't have places where they can get their hair done, or maybe this place is full of political signs that are a little bit upsetting, and how do you make a space to bring in and diversify your casts if you are not also making them feel safe and supported? And I think that the corollary in the choral world is it enough to bring in a couple of singers, of BIPOC singers, into an overwhelmingly white space without supporting them, bringing them into that space? Or is there more work that needs to be done? And I wonder, one, if you've had any experiences, and I'm sure you have, being the only singer of color in a space, how did that feel? How did you work through that feeling? And are there times that you have felt more supported by a company or a choir in bringing you into the space? Melissa.
I'm just gonna give a very brief story. And then I don't want to take up too much time on this question because I was just talking, but I really, on the positive wave that I'm riding at the moment, I just want to say, you guys, you know my hair by now. So glad you brought that up. Thank you for talking about that. I know that people that have hair like this, or this is a certain type of curl type hair or curlier. Um, um, Sometimes when you're in a production, they just put it back because nobody knows what to do with it. They just do this. Thank you, Paul, for your silent commentary. This is not how I want to walk out of my house. No, we need to uplift this hair. You know what I mean? But this happens to me, I would say 97% of the time. Okay, that might not sound like a positive story, but there was one time when I felt so supported by a wig department that I came in for a wig fitting one day, and the person who had a wig for me had taken the time to get a wig of real hair that matched my hair perfectly. This has never happened to me before, and I'm sure this has not happened to many of my colleagues. It matched the curl type, it matched the color, and it was kind of like an extra piece that you put in. It amplified my hair voice, and I thought I cried. I cried when I came into that. It was totally unexpected. He wanted to surprise me, and he also let me keep the piece. And I was so touched by that, and it was a very special moment after my hair being shunned for so many productions. So I just wanted to start with that story, and something like that makes you feel very supported in so many other ways. Like, hair has a lot to do with where you come from and your ancestral background. And it was just such a special moment. And I felt like that was one of the most wonderful things that a company or somebody working in a company could have possibly done for me.
That's really lovely. Paul.
I mean, thank you for sharing that lovely anecdote. It's so joyful when something like that happens, either to yourself or you see it happening in the room. As far as what organizations can do to help support and amplify just voices in general, just personhoods in general, is I've been a part of a few productions, including our meetings here at Queen's Voice Lab, where there is an opportunity for and it doesn't have to be a long drawn out thing, but just a few minutes, maybe 5-10 minutes at the start of each block of rehearsal, just to go around, perhaps, not everybody has to feel like they have to participate, but if you have any kind of emotional, physical, mental barriers or boundaries that day, to be able to share those, to be able to share, even something simple as, just a daily reminder of what you're, especially if it's mostly a BIPOC cast, of which, if there are certain people in the room who are not familiar with the way that names are pronounced, just being able to sit in a circle and bring the name that I was given by my ancestors into the room, just, and bring that into the space, with no ulterior motive, with no motive at all, except just to celebrate yourself and celebrate people that brought you there, just for 1 second. And those are tiny things that make me feel empowered, that make me able to bring my whole self into a room, especially since the big machine opera industry, they've come up with a very efficient way to do things, There is, you know, kind of when you walk into a regional opera house and on the first day, like we know what to expect and we know, you know, how things are done. And I don't have a specific, pushback to the way that things are done all the time. But if there is a 5-10 minute process in the beginning, and also that time feels, clearing, feels safe, feels like I can bring, it's actually, even if you take away those 10 minutes by the clock's hand, think about how, when we meditate or when we clear our minds, think about how efficient we go about our day. Think about how, we're able to speak or sing with the core of our being, not just the core of our voice, but just really bring ourselves into the room. And it makes things, efficient and more palpably just resonant. And it's not a huge thing, but it just, it just makes you so seen. And I've, there, something as simple as saying our names, or there have been times where, we would come up with like a short set of, reminders or room rules, things like that, where, we, in order to even have an ensemble warm up together, we chant those things, and see how it goes organically. And it's just, it's a beautiful thing.
So making space for the people in the room to be seen and heard and to exist as they are. That's sort of what I'm getting from both of you, that, the fact that Melisa's wig person took the time to support her as she is, and instead of trying to diminish or hide the fact that people take the time to pronounce Paul's name correctly. Hai-Ting, do you have any other experiences that you'd like to share?
This is not an experience, but it is an insight that I found fascinating when I was doing some research on the first female astronauts at NASA, and that I think NASA has carried forward this this practice into their latest astronaut class, which is 50% female identified and 50% BIPOC. So when they first brought in women to this very macho male culture, a psychologist, this was the 70s, so a psychologist suggested that in order for a minority to feel like they can express themselves and be themselves in a majority culture, there has to be a critical mass. And this psychologist suggested that it was something like 10%, which led NASA to getting 6 women astronauts out of a class of, I think it was 29 or something, approximately 10%. And a lot of those women expressed a real gratitude towards NASA doing that, because they had a critical mass where they could talk amongst themselves. They could feel like they had people they could go to, they could have allies, but they weren't just one or two, so they didn't have to be monolithic. There was enough variation amongst those 6 women that they felt like they could express themselves individually, but also have a support group. And I think that's one of the real dangers of tokenism, that you bring in somebody who then is inevitably an outsider because they are the only one or the only 2 in the room who look like they do or come from their background. So if you want to make real progress, a company that wants to make real progress is going to have to do better than hiring 1 or 2 of of any type. And I hope that all of this sounds so foreign to a young generation of people from Queens. I hope that our generation and the one before is going to die out, and and the amazing diversity of perspectives, exteriors, gender and racial expressions is going to be the dream of the American melting pot that we talked about when we were younger, that has since felt like it was getting farther and farther away from us. So I hope that all of this sounds ridiculous and foreign very soon, but it's not there yet.
And that's why I think it's, it's important to have this conversation. And I really appreciate and applaud the three of you for being so open and candid about your experiences, because I think the other thing that allows for tokenization and stereotyping and isolation is that we have for so long been encouraged not to talk about it, right? If we talk about it, as Paul was saying, if we talk about it, we're making people uncomfortable, we're rocking the boat too much, they're not going to want to hire us, they're not going to want to work with us. But if enough of us are talking about it, they can't fire all of us. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge the question from Sarah on, which is, and we've started to talk about this already, but what can companies tangibly do to provide and more support and make this type of change? And I think that all the things that we've discussed so far, which providing space for people to be heard, 10 minutes of time for check-in, having people who understand natural hair and makeup and all of those things, making sure that there's a representative enough group of singers in the room so that the nobody is tokenized or isolated. I wonder if, as a last bit of conversation today, if there's anything else that's coming up for the three of you that could be action items for companies or even for young singers as they are going out and making their own careers. Paul, you're nodding. Why don't you go ahead?
I have a thought about actually our union. I'm trying to be as diplomatic as possible. There are tangible things that I see opera companies doing, especially in programming. And I hope, even the cynic in me hopes, like earnestly hopes, and maybe even thinks that if these works by non-white, non-European creators are going to proliferate in the future, and I hope and I think that they will, if not to the degree that we've seen in the last 2 years, hopefully substantially more than we've seen before 2019. But that takes the effort of both the presenting organization and our union. I have been a part of organizations where they want to do more works that feature an ensemble of more diverse cast, of a more diverse chorus, of a more diverse ensemble. And because, this is, it's such a complicated issue, but with my apologies, if I might say that a big aim for unions is for retention of its members, is for, especially in larger houses where, a percentage of the ensemble by the CBA has to be, 80%, 70%, 90%, whatever it is. When there are opportunities for companies to present an opera like Omar, for example, which the LA Opera just did, and it's a wonderful opera about a Muslim slave, and it utilized a beautiful cast, a diverse ensemble of, and the ensemble was mostly Black singers. And while it's wonderful for, for many of these colleagues and friends for the first time to step out onto that grand hall, there's, for subsequent productions of Marriage of Figaro, Carmen, the regular canon, the quote unquote typical canon, the AGMA rules or the AGMA CBAs stipulate that unfortunately most of them can't, and that's what it boils down to. And I think our union, spearheaded by us, by younger people, need to, of course, find a way to protect ourselves, protect the members who have existed in that union for many decades, but also find a way to, for us to be able to cast young, diverse singers without running into that huge wall all the time. And I have some ideas on, on some of these talking points, but that's, it's too complicated to get into now. But I think it's worth for all of us to think about and be vocal to our union.
Great. So one of the things that we can do is start to think about the structures that are in place and what is supporting us and what is maybe not as helpful, and start to think about how those structures could change. Melissa or Haiting, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Kamal, I actually wanted to hear your thoughts on the creative side of these things, because besides tokenizing the bodies of singers, I know that you have lots of thoughts and experience from the other side, a different face of tokenization.
Yeah, should we do another panel?
I know. You had sent ahead this great question. I mean, I guess now we're almost out of time, but you had sent ahead this great question of, do you think that the creation of new work is the way to solve this this issue? And I'm sure you have thoughts.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think it's the same issue that we've been talking about, but the flip side of it is that just as you could be pigeonholed as a singer, only doing particular kinds of rep that matches the face that you kind of have, you also could be pigeonholed as a creator into the kinds of rep that you're allowed to do. And the conversations that I've had with many other composers, BIPOC composers, around this is, it's great, that we're being commissioned to write stories from our culture. Most of us are interested in writing stories from our culture, but we are also interested in writing stories that are not specifically rooted in culture. And I think one of the interesting things in talking about how BIPOC composers approach writing for people of their culture is they're people. We think of them as people, and we don't have to, we're not trying to make something that is, going to be evocative of Egypt, or, by putting a flat 2 in the scale, or we're not going to, put a habanero rhythm in the middle of the song just because we can. And I think that whole thing about flattening, that is the thing that we have in common between, in all aspects of this conversation, is, are you addressing the full human, or are you addressing the flattened version of the human? And until we are able to bring our full humanity to our art form, it's not truly equitable. I think that's true across the board. So I think that we are towards the end of our time now. So I'm going to thank everyone so much for joining us today. This is the last panel of our 2022 Queen's Voice Lab panel series. You can see all recordings of all 3 panels here on YouTube. Before we go, we would like to thank the Queen's Council on the Arts for supporting this panel series. Queen's Voice Lab is a project of Vital Opera, a social impact arts organization dedicated to cultivating human connection through the medium of operatic expression. You can find out more about Vital Opera at its website, www.vitalopera.org. You can find Queen's Voice Lab on Facebook and Instagram, or reach out to us directly at queensvoicelab@gmail.com. Thank you, everyone who has tuned in live. Thank you, those of you who are watching on YouTube, and we wish you a beautiful rest of your day.